From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking about the Biden administration's first 100 days in office and what it's meant for U.S. Middle East policy. There's a lot to discuss, from Afghanistan to Iran, but thankfully we've got two great guests on the program today to help us make sense of things. Salem and Randa Slim. Paul is MEI's president, and Randa is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Randa, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair, for having us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Paul, the Biden administration has been in office for just over 100 days now. What have been your initial impressions?
I would look at it in two ways. One is what the administration has or hasn't done, its policies. And the second way to look at it is what actions have been done in the region in anticipation of, Trump lost, Biden won, and how have countries in the region adjusted to this new administration. So they're kind of two perspectives. I would say, looking at the first 100 days, underlining that it's just been 100 days. So there's a lot of bureaucratic, getting people in position, getting people up to speed, reviewing policy, getting into the details of things. 100 days, particularly at a time when the U.S. is going through so many crises, is not a long time. So it's not a lot of time to assess. But I would say there have been two big things that have happened in the first 100 days. And they are, of course, as promised, the attempt to renegotiate a return or negotiate a return to the joint, JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. That is a big deal, obviously. And we can talk about how that's going or not going. And it has huge reverberations in the region. The second big decision was the decision taken by President Biden to commit to a full withdrawal from Afghanistan by September 11, 2021. So, and we can talk about that separately. That's a huge issue as well. On sort of smaller movement and so on, we've had an appointment of a special envoy to the civil war in Yemen, which I think is a great thing to try to help resolve that crisis. We've seen the appointment actually of one of MEI's board members, Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, as a special envoy to deal with the Horn of Africa, the crisis on the Renaissance Dam between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. That's a major issue. On the Arab-Israeli conflict, not much movement, but reopening to the Palestinians. But the big two really are Iran and Afghanistan in my mind.
Randa, how about you? What have been your key takeaways so far?
Well, I second everything, of course, Paul has said here, and I share his analysis. I think the one thing that comes to me after 100 days, which is also indicative of where this administration is heading in the Middle East, is that, as they have said during the electoral campaign, that Middle East is not going to be, a priority in terms of time and resources, and that, first the domestic issues, the economy, the COVID, then the alliances. Hence, the first overseas trip of the president is to the UK and to attend NATO meetings, to attend EU meetings. And so the emphasis on the importance of restoration of old alliances, also the Quad meeting that, which is very much there as part of the priority of the Biden administration in terms of its competition with China. And when you look at the interim national security strategic guidance that they issued, the Middle East literally is one paragraph, and it very much, and they have been acting accordingly. They have been very consistent in acting according to what they said they will do, from Yemen to Iran to Afghanistan. As also they say in the guidance, the smart use of the military tool, because they keep emphasizing diplomacy is the first tool in engaging with the Middle East, and engaging with other conflicts around the world. But there will be time to back it up by smart use of the military. And the targeted attack that President Biden ordered last February on Iraqi militias inside Syrian territory in reaction to the attacks by these militias on U.S. assets in Erbil and in Iraq, shows exactly how they are planning to deploy these military assets as minimal as possible, but in a smart and effective way, with the focus on the diplomacy. And we have seen the Secretary of State engage in a strategic dialogue with Iraq, in which he emphasized the relationship going forward between Iraq and the United States is going to be not security focused, but rather than multidimensional and multifaceted.
Paul, what's surprised you the most in terms of what the administration has and hasn't done so far?
I guess what maybe surprised me most was the decision to implement this withdrawal from Afghanistan in such a sort of clear, decisive way. Obviously, there are no good options in Afghanistan, but we had heard a lot from this administration and from President Biden's previous sort of positions that he would believing in a small footprint, counterterrorism missions. We see them staying in Syria, staying in Iraq, staying elsewhere. Also, Joe Biden was in the White House when that decision in 2011, for completely different reasons and conditions, the decision was made to withdraw from Iraq. And in hindsight, that turned out to be a fairly disastrous decision and enabled the rise of ISIS back in Iraq. And it seemed to me an unnecessary major risk to take, and certainly a big win for the international sort of jihadist movement. I was doubly surprised that they linked it, the date of the withdrawal, to the date of the attack. Which would beautifully fit into the jihadist narrative that, we attacked the US, they tried to do something about it. 20 years, they declared defeat and retreat. I fear and I worry, other than worrying about, of course, the people of Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan, and what awaits them, I worry that this maybe was somewhat of an unnecessary risk to take early in the administration. Otherwise, as Randa said, and maybe this is a good thing, it's not an administration of surprises. They're thoughtful, they communicate, they think things through. It's coherent. Generally, the things that they're doing, they talked about them in the campaign, they talked about them in the transition. No big surprises in most of the issues that we're seeing unfold. And no surprise in the fact that, as Randa said, the Middle East is certainly not, other than the issue really of Iran and Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, in a sense, they're trying to, remove themselves from Afghanistan. Outside of the nuclear deal with Iran, everything else is second or third rate interest or priority. And in a way, they leave the region to itself. And that's where I think, what I mentioned at the beginning, the other aspect of talking about the Biden administration is what is the effect in the region, on the region, simply of having Trump having been defeated, Biden coming in, his perspectives, let alone the general dynamic that oil and gas are no longer in the future, aren't going to be as important as they were. Both Republican and Democratic administrations and people in Congress have kind of a little bit, I would say, be fed up with the Middle East. So many problems, so many conflicts, not able to solve them. So it's a common denominator among Republicans and Democrats to really want to downgrade and try to get out of the Middle East as much as they can. So that causes, actions and reactions in the Middle East, some of which are in terms of escalation. We've seen escalations from the Iranian side, the Houthis and others. Maybe that's linked to the negotiations with the U.S., but we've also seen attempts at, reconciliation or de-escalation, some contacts between the Saudis and the Iranians. We know there have been contacts between the Emiratis and the Iranians. So, there's both dynamics going on at once.
Randa, I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that point as well. Looking at the kind of key regional actors and how they've responded to the new administration from the Gulf to Iran, what stood out to you?
Can I first quickly add on something that Paul has said, is that, the Biden administration is facing a congressional landscape where really you have almost bipartisan consensus in defense and military foreign policy and defense issues, that are very much in sync with the priorities of the Biden administration in these two areas. Except I think we have, except on Afghanistan, where you have the majority of the Republican, exactly arguing along the same lines that Paul has just made in terms of lessons learned from the hasty withdrawal in 2011 from Iraq and to what followed it in 2014, and whether we're going to see the same scenario unfold in Afghanistan after the U.S. forces withdrawal in September. And then you see the administration, making all sorts of arguments why the two situations are different, why even the U.S. force posture is different, and that lessons learned from Iraq, are going to be taken into how we withdraw from Afghanistan. But the other big file where I think there is a bipartisan consensus, which is going to make difficult for the Biden administration to move on, and that consensus is contrary or contradicts the priorities of the Biden administration, is the Iran nuclear file. I think there is a bipartisan consensus on seeing the 2015 JCPOA as being deficient, and that returning to it, as the administration now keeps saying, is their goal in the negotiations with Iran in Vienna, which is compliance for compliance, that returning to 2015 should not be our answer, but rather we should think about renegotiating the deal. At least a lot of the people on both the Democratic and Republican are. And it's going to be interesting to see how the Biden administration is going to be dealing with that, because as more news comes out about the kind of concession on sanctions that the Biden administration is willing to take in return for what behaviors from Iran, and especially as we see more divisions, public divisions surface from inside Iran, as we have seen with the recent Zarif tape. And so you are going to see that space becoming a little bit more complicated for Biden, which still, especially the president himself, is still committed to a return to the deal, because this is the issue that he feels is the one that can basically drag the region, but also drag the administration into a longer-term commitment to the Middle East. For example, if there were an accidental war between Israel and Iran, which will bring, the U.S. back en force to the Middle East, and something that a scenario they totally want to avoid. Having said that, I think where I see the regional actor very much building on what Paul has said is that they are still in a wait and see mode. I think there is definitely in the Gulf unhappiness, if we can put it this way, with how the negotiations on the nuclear file are proceeding. We have seen, unlike with the Obama administration, when they were negotiating the nuclear file, you see more public attempts by the Biden administration to engage early on with the Gulf countries, share with them what they are doing in the negotiation, hear them out. We recently saw, the meetings between senior Israeli officials and senior Biden administration officials on the nuclear negotiations. And it was clear from the readout of the talks is that both sides heard each other, both sides understand each other, but they are not going to come to an agreement on the issue of the file. I think the issue is with Israel going to be going forward, and the negotiation between Israel and the Biden administration is on rules of the road, when it comes to Israel trying to take action to protect its interest from threats emanating from Iran. And it was interesting reading the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance. There was a sentence which in the paragraph, the one paragraph about the Middle East, the sentence in which says, quote, "We will not give our partners in the Middle East a blank check to pursue policy at odds with American interests and values," end of quote. And I think definitely they are referring to Saudi in Yemen, but also, in my opinion, they are referring to Israel as far as Iran is concerned.
Paul, building on what Randa just said about the administration's efforts to revive the JCPOA, what are your expectations on that front? Do you think we're likely to see a broader deal that encompasses some of the other contentious topics like the missile program or regional proxy activities?
No, I think both administrations, if we're going to call them that, have an interest in reviving the nuclear deal at a minimum like it was. Obviously, the U.S., each one wants a bit more. The U.S. wants JCPOA plus or plus plus, and Iran wants JCPOA with all sanctions lifted. But neither party is going to get all of that. But they both have an interest in getting back to the core of the deal, which already existed. From the US side, that gives them more of a handle and reassurance that at least the nuclear program of Iran is under control and surveillance as long as their administration is in place and further. And that's enough for them now. And from the Iranian side, while they will try to get all sanctions lifted, it's better to get half sanctions lifted than no sanctions lifted. So what I expect to happen is that after much, pushing and pulling and politicking in both countries, as Randa said, there's huge pressure from Congress to get more, but the administration has the capacity to get back into the deal and lift some of the sanctions. Congress controls others. And there's huge politics in Iran, obviously. And as Randa follows this more closely than I do, they have elections. And so my expectation is at some point this year, the two parties will return to the deal. They will also announce with much fanfare that they're having all these, we're having the talks about, quote, other things. I expect nothing to come of the other things. I think they will pocket the return to the nuclear deal. On the U.S. side, that is a personal political issue for Joe Biden. This was almost, he was in the White House. So it's personal for him to get it back. Like it was personal for Donald Trump to cancel it because it was Obama's deal, it's personal for Biden to get it back. And once he has it back, I think he would have ticked that box, and he will not be engaged much in all the other issues that Iran is involved in. I think he'll leave it to the region to sort it out, and his attention will go elsewhere. From the Iranian side, they will pocket whatever lifting of sanctions they can. They would like more lifting, but they'll take what they can get. Obviously, they have huge domestic, social, economic problems. Whatever money they can use, some of it will be used domestically. And definitely, they will use some of it to reinforce their regional presence in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and elsewhere. They're committed also to that strategy. So I think that's what's likely to happen. I don't expect conflict. I think the escalation that Iran is doing is part of the negotiation. You'll try to get more leverage before the talks happen. We mustn't forget that Israel has been hitting Iran hard, both inside Iran and in the region. And while Iran hasn't really responded in any significant way, they have to do something. So they escalate here and there, but I don't expect any war with Iran. It's in nobody's interest, certainly not in Iran's interest.
Randa, the other factor, of course, is that Iran has reportedly been engaging in talks with Saudi Arabia in Iraq. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you see as the prospects for that and a potential easing of tensions on that front.
Look, let me start by saying that Prime Minister Kadhimi has been working on getting this meeting going and this process going for some time, from the days of even Al-Abadi and when Mr. Haider Al-Abadi was Prime Minister, and that continues through the term of Mr. Adel Abdel Mahdi, and now it is becoming more center for Iraq engagement since Mr. Kadhimi is himself in the Prime Minister office. And he's the one who's really leading this effort. And Iraq is interested because they have always been that intersection, in this competition or in this fight, in this war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the more tensions are de-escalating between the two, the more rules of the game are figured out between the two, the more de-escalation happens in other proxy theaters that involve the two, like Yemen, then the better it is for Iraq. And the question is, this kind of role require an architecture of diplomacy and process support inside the government of Iraq. And like Algeria, for example, used to have, have when it was playing the role of the mediator in regional conflicts in the old days. I don't know if Iraq has it and can sustain it, but right now it pivots around Mr. Qademi, his personal relationship with the leadership in both Iran and Saudi Arabia. Look, there is interest on both sides, partly prompted by the change in tone out of Washington, and partly because also Washington has been pushing for that. In the old days under Trump, whenever, anybody, whether it is a state actor or an NGO, tries to do something on the Iranian-Saudi front, there was a strong pushback from the Trump administration, especially its Iran-focused officials, against any kind of rapprochement or anybody at creating rapprochement spaces between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I think this move by Iraq is also encouraged by a change in the U.S. administration, which is, as Paul said, wants the regionals to take care more responsibility of their region's affairs. And this is a trend, by the way, which has been ongoing. As we talk in the future about what Biden does, what Biden does not do in the Middle East, also, I think over the years, the ability of outsiders, non-extra regionals, to influence the dynamics in the region in a way that, for example, they used to during the Bush Senior administration, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you had a unipolar moment, with the United States being that superpower. Those days are gone. They are now, as we have seen recently, countries are now realigning themselves, trying to strike alliance, starting dialogues. Again, partly because it is encouraged by the administration, and because it sees the administration is not going to play that role of a grand master mediator in a way of conflict, but also because the dynamics of the region are becoming regional. The regional politics are becoming regional, and more of the regional actors are now playing a leading role in moving these dynamic forward. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's bad, as we have seen, in reaction to the uprising of 2011 with the counter coups and with the counter-revolutionary practices by some states in the region. So I think we are going to see this particular rapprochement continue. You are going to see Iraq, and especially Qademi, because he is trusted by the Saudis and because he has access through a number of Iraqi actors, including Najaf, to a number of Iranian actors in Qom and Tehran, to be able to play this role. However, you are going to see an Iranian actor that's going to be hampered by what's going to unfold in the next few months inside Iran with their elections and its repercussions. And it's going to be also hampered by the lack of trust that has been existing between the two parties, Saudi Arabia and Iran, for a very long time. So I think it is a beginning. It is still at a testing phase. Both sides are testing each other's in terms of their intentions, in terms of their willingness to really seriously engage in this discussion. But I think it's going to take a long way to lead to the kind of result that we are hoping is going to lead. Now, in the interim, there can be some small, modest confidence-building measures to be engaged by both parties. But I think this process is still hostage to a lot of the political dynamics in the region, especially in what happens inside Iran with the election, but also to the dynamic between Israel and Iran and how Israel sees its steps next in reaction to the negotiations that are unfolding in Vienna.
We're running a little short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to get both your thoughts on where you see things going from here, starting with you, Paul. How do you see things playing out in the next 100 days and beyond?
Well, I think, the thing we haven't mentioned, which is the most important thing for the region in general, is the ongoing pandemic, which in many of the big countries like Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, and others, which don't have the resources of the UAE or others, is in a terrible third or fourth waves. There is very little vaccines on the horizon for these countries without the major resources of the Gulf. For the U.S., I think this is important that as the U.S. catches up with its domestic vaccination, obviously it has a massive surplus, will have even a bigger surplus. And we're seeing already how that becomes part of U.S. diplomacy. We're seeing it now with India. But for the Middle East, certainly for the people of the Middle East, getting a vaccine relief and getting out from under this pandemic is, for most people, the number one priority by far. This pandemic has brought the worst or the biggest economic contraction since World War II. The levels of poverty, unemployment, the freezing of many sectors of many economies is tremendous, and it's going to take many years to dig out from under that. And it comes at a time when the governments of the region already their resources were strapped, their levels of debt and deficit were high. It also happened at a time when oil prices plummeted downwards. So the Gulf didn't have many resources to help out other countries. Again, this is something that the Biden administration understands very well. Obviously, that is the essence of their policy inside the United States. Step one, get vaccinations out. Step two, revive the economy. The same priorities prevail in most of the countries of the Middle East, and the U.S. can play, first of all, a big role in international vaccine coordination and provision. And secondly, given that the IMF and the World Bank and many of the international resources are, linked or in the U.S. Or linked to U.S. Allies and partners, whether in Europe, Asia, or the Gulf, the U.S. can play a leading role helping the bigger, poorer countries of the region where the tens of millions of people live, get out from the worst, really, catastrophe that's hit the region, I would say, since World War II.
Randa, you've got the final word here.
Well, I mean, I agree with my friend Paul here and support every point he made. I would add that, as the Biden administration says, is one of its priority is to move swiftly to earn back U.S. position of leadership in international institutions, and definitely with diplomacy and as a primary tool or the first resort, and military the last resort. I think the approach that Paul mentioned, which is the vaccines, leading the efforts in the world to provide vaccines, to countries, including in this case in the Middle East that have shortages, but also leading on the issue of climate change. And we have seen already the administration, convene its first climate summit. I think climate challenges of the Middle East are going to become more and more important going forward. And there are areas of opportunities for cooperation among the countries of the Middle East and between the Middle East and the US here on this issue. And the third thing, I think, again, is re-emphasizing our relationship with people, providing educational opportunities, the recent announcement on lifting the ban on visas for students from different countries, including from the Middle East, to come and study in the United States, provide more education opportunities, partnership between American universities and the university in the Middle East, working with the next generation, I think is also should be an important focus, and I think will be an important focus of the Biden administration going forward, and it will be a benefit to the people of the Middle East. Thank you.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Randa, Paul, thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Paul and Alistair.
Good to be with you, Randa.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.